Dirt hits your face. Wet, heavy, reeking of clay. It fills your mouth before you can close it. You spit, you gag. Another shovelful comes. Above you, because you are standing in a grave, your grave, a priest stares down with the flat expression of a man doing paperwork. He is not angry, he is not sad, he is bored. You are not dead. Your heart is slamming against your ribs, but it doesn't matter. As far as the law is concerned, as far as your wife, your children, your neighbors are concerned, you have just stopped existing. The priest's Latin drones above you. Separatio leprosorum, the mass of separation. You are dead to the world and alive only to God. When they pull you out, they hand you a wooden clapper. From this day forward, whenever you approach another human being, you will shake it so they hear you coming, so they can run. This was the law in 12th century Europe. No exceptions. One exception. In 1174, a 13-year-old boy received the same diagnosis. They did not put him in a hole. They put him on a throne. They did not hand him a clapper. They handed him a sword. His body was rotting. His mind was on fire. And he was about to do something that military historians still struggle to explain. If you're someone who believes history is more than dates and dead names, you're in the right place. Subscribe, because this story only gets darker from here. Jerusalem, 1170. Not the ruins tourists photograph today. A functioning medieval capital, noisy, dusty, teeming with merchants and pilgrims and armored men. The Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem is 70 years old, a narrow ribbon of Christian territory pressed between the Mediterranean and a Muslim world that has not forgotten who stole it. In the royal courtyard, a group of noble boys are playing a rough game. They dig their fingernails into each other's arms to see who cries first. They yelp, they pull away, they compare their whelps. One boy is winning. Prince Baldwin, 9 years old, heir to the throne, he is laughing. He holds out his right arm with the casual confidence of a child who thinks he's tougher than everyone else. The other boys claw at his skin. He doesn't react, not a wince, not a twitch. William of Tyre, the royal tutor, is watching from across the courtyard. He is an educated man, clergyman, scholar, fluent in Latin, French, and Arabic. He notices the boy's stillness and something cold settles in his stomach. He crosses the courtyard, takes the prince's arm, and without warning, drives his own fingernails deep into the flesh of the child's forearm. The skin splits, blood wells up. Baldwin looks down at it, then up at his tutor. I feel nothing. Think about what those 3 words meant in 1170. William knew immediately. Everyone in that court would have known. The numbness beginning in the extremities, the nerves going dark, like lamps being snuffed out one by one. This was leprosy, and not the slow kind. This was lepra lepromatosa, the aggressive form that would eventually consume the boy's hands, his feet, and his face. The boy standing in that courtyard was already dying. The court made a decision that tells you everything about their desperation. They buried the diagnosis. They told no one. They wrapped his arm, made excuses, and prayed. 4 years, they kept the secret. Then Baldwin's father died, and nothing was secret anymore. King Amalric died of dysentery in 1174. An unglamorous end for a warrior king, but a common one, when bad water kills more men than swords. The throne was empty. They crowned Baldwin in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the holiest site in Christendom. He was 13. His right hand was already losing function, and the kingdom he had just inherited was a house of cards standing in a hurricane. Here is what you need to understand about the Crusader states at this moment. They were not powerful nations. They were thin, fragile colonies, sustained by 2 things: reinforcements from Europe that arrived sporadically, and divisions within the Muslim world that kept their enemies fighting each other. Both lifelines were fraying. And in Egypt and Syria, a Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din, Saladin, was doing something no Muslim leader had achieved in decades. He was unifying the fractured Islamic world, Egypt, Syria, Mesopotamia. One by one, the pieces clicking into place. When the puzzle was complete, the assembled force would be aimed directly at Jerusalem. The barons looked at their child king and saw a problem to manage. Raymond of Tripoli assumed the regency. The nobles began their calculations. Who would really rule? Who would inherit what when the boy inevitably died? They expected Baldwin to do one simple thing: fade away. He did the opposite. He threw himself into physical training with an intensity that unsettled everyone around him. When the numbness spread and his grip failed, he learned to steer a warhorse with his knees, clamping his legs against the animal's flanks with enough force to turn 1,000 pounds of muscle and armor. When his fingers couldn't hold a sword, he had the hilt lashed to his gauntlet with leather straps, binding steel to flesh so the weapon couldn't be dropped, even if his hand was dead. Think about what that means. He was strapping a blade to a limb he couldn't feel. If the sword jammed, if the leather cut into diseased skin, he would have no way of knowing until someone peeled the gauntlet off and found blood. By 15, when he assumed full authority, the boy who couldn't feel his own hand had become something no one anticipated: a functional military commander who happened to be dying. And he understood something his courtiers didn't. He had no time for a slow apprenticeship. Saladin saw a fractured kingdom led by a sick child and concluded the conquest would be easy. Baldwin knew what that meant. You don't play defensive chess. When the clock is already running out, you strike first. He launched raids deep into the Bekaa Valley, the fertile heartland near Damascus, not cautious patrols, aggressive cavalry strikes that disrupted Saladin's supply lines and left the Saracen governors scrambling. When the reports reached Saladin, the intelligence didn't make sense. A boy who was supposed to be dying was leading cavalry charges in the scorching Syrian summer. Saladin noted it, filed it away, and kept building his army. He was about to learn that the most dangerous opponent is one who has already accepted the worst thing that can happen to him. November 1177. Hold this date in your mind. Saladin crosses the border from Egypt with 26,000 men. Mamluks, Kurdish heavy cavalry, Sudanese infantry, the largest invasion force the Crusaders have faced in a generation. Baldwin has fewer than 500 knights, 50 to 1. He rides south to the fortress city of Ascalon with every available man and pulls the gates shut. To Saladin, this confirms everything. The Leper King is afraid. The boy is hiding behind stone walls to die safely. The Sultan makes the decision he will regret for the rest of his life. He ignores Baldwin entirely. He marches his massive army past Ascalon, straight toward undefended Jerusalem. The road is open. Victory is inevitable. Confidence becomes arrogance. Saladin gives the order to disperse. His soldiers scatter across the countryside, raiding villages, burning crops, loading camels with plunder, armor unbuckled, weapons packed in baggage carts. They are not marching toward a battle. They are strolling toward a coronation. Inside Ascalon, Baldwin watches smoke rise from the villages to the north. He can see the enemy streaming past his walls, heading for his capital, ignoring him as though he is already dead. He faces the cleanest choice of his life. Stay behind these walls, survive, watch the kingdom burn, or open the gates. Opening the gates means riding 500 men into the open desert against 50 times their number. His advisors tell him it is suicide. The math tells him it is suicide. But Baldwin has been living under a death sentence since he was 9 years old. What he cannot live with is cowardice. He orders the gates opened. The Knights Templar, warrior monks who've sworn an oath never to retreat, they fall in beside him. Together they ride north along the coast, hidden by dunes and the glare of the afternoon sun, shadowing the sprawling, oblivious Saracen army. No war drums, no trumpets, just hooves on sand and the ragged breathing of a boy king who is almost certainly strapped to his saddle to stay upright. As the sun drops on November 25th, the Crusader scouts crest a ridge near a shallow ravine called Montgisard. Below them, scattered across the landscape, lies Saladin's army. Soldiers washing in the stream, horses grazing untethered, cooking fires sending lazy smoke into the sky. They have no idea. But before the charge, before the order that will change everything, something happens that lifts this moment out of military history and into something older. The Bishop of Bethlehem steps forward, carrying a fragment of wood encased in gold, the true cross, the relic believed to be the very timber on which Christ died. Baldwin struggles off his horse. He falls to his knees in the dust, and in front of 500 hardened killers, men who have taken lives, who have watched friends die screaming, the King of Jerusalem begins to weep. He doesn't pray for victory. He prays for forgiveness. He begs God not to let the kingdom fall because of his sins, because of his sickness. These soldiers stand frozen, watching their broken king cry in the sand. And something turns inside them. They are no longer fighting for land. They are no longer fighting for wages. They are fighting for him. Baldwin stands, wipes his face. His bandaged hand drops forward. 500 visors slam shut. 500 lances level. 500 war horses lean downhill. A medieval heavy cavalry charge is not like anything in modern warfare. It is not sustained fire. It is not a gradual engagement. It is a single annihilating kinetic event. 500 armored projectiles accelerating downhill with the collective force of a building collapse. When they hit Saladin's lines, the sound carried across the hills. Saladin's soldiers had no formation, no warning. Some were still pulling on their mail. Others were trying to catch their horses. The Crusaders smashed through the baggage train and drove straight into the heart of the army, like a spear through an unguarded stomach. And at the center of this hurricane rode Baldwin IV. To the Muslim soldiers, he was a ghost, the dying boy their sultan had dismissed, bursting out of the sunset, like something from a fever dream. The word spread faster than the cavalry itself. The leper is here. The leper is here. 26,000 men dissolved into panic. Numbers mean nothing when you cannot organize them. The ravine at Montgisard became a killing chute. Men piled into each other, cut down in a frenzy of steel and dust. Saladin himself was engulfed by the rout. His personal bodyguard, the elite Mamluks, formed a ring around him and were slaughtered to the last man, buying their sultan just enough time to escape. Not on his war horse, on a racing camel. He fled into the desert night, abandoning his army, his baggage, and his pride. By the time he reached Egypt, his force had effectively ceased to exist. Montgisard was not a victory. It was a detonation, the greatest military upset of the medieval world, delivered by a 16-year-old boy whose body was eating itself alive. And Saladin, humiliated and reassessing everything, reportedly said, "God does not want the Christians to lose this land while this king is alive." Remember those words, because they are both the highest compliment and the most precise warning about what happens next. Victory at Montgisard didn't buy Baldwin a cure. It bought the kingdom time and spent what little time remained in his body. This is the part the movies sanitize. They give him a polished silver mask and a tragic elegance. The reality was biology at its most merciless. By his late teens, the cartilage in his nose had begun to dissolve, the bridge collapsing inward, his lips retracted from his teeth, creating a permanent involuntary grimace. His eyebrows disappeared, the skin of his face thickened into leonine folds. Then came the blindness. The nerves controlling his eyelids were paralyzed. He could not blink. His corneas dried out, ulcerated, and slowly turned opaque. Imagine trying to read a battle report or judge whether the man kneeling before you is lying while the world dissolves into grey static. And then there was the smell. As tissue in his extremities died, gangrene set in. The King of Jerusalem decomposed while sitting on his throne. His advisors had to lean close to hear his fading voice, forcing themselves not to gag. Did he wear a silver mask? Almost certainly not. No contemporary source mentions one. The chroniclers describe heavy silk veils, not to create mystery, but to spare his subjects the sight of their king's disintegrating face. The veil is not a costume. It is the desperate act of a young man trying to hold himself together while the world depends on him. And yet, his mind never faltered. He attended every council meeting, carried in a litter when he could no longer walk. When his hands failed, he governed by stamp and dictation. He became a voice issuing from behind curtains, a disembodied intelligence running a kingdom on the edge of extinction. But a king needs more than intelligence. He needs an heir. Baldwin was sterile. The future of the dynasty rested entirely on his sister Sibylla and the man she married. He needed a warrior who could lead armies in his place. What he got was Guy de Lusignan, a French knight from a minor noble family, handsome, and possessing the strategic instincts of a fence post. Sibylla fell for him. Baldwin, his options narrowing by the week, consented to the marriage in 1180. It was a decision made in desperation, and it would cost everything. By 1183, Baldwin could barely function. He formally handed the military regency to Guy. The court faction that had backed Guy rejoiced. Finally, a healthy man in charge. They were about to discover the difference between looking like a king and being one. Saladin crossed the Jordan with a major force. Guy mustered the largest crusader army in the kingdom's history. He held superior ground. He controlled the water. The veterans of Montgisard gripped their lances and waited for the order. It never came. Guy froze. He stood on the high ground while Saladin raided the countryside, filled his wagons with loot and rode home without a scratch. When the news reached the blind, bedridden king in Jerusalem, the corpse on the throne stirred. Baldwin stripped Guy of the regency. Then he made his final move. He crowned his 5-year-old nephew as co-king and heir. The coronation is one of the most heartbreaking scenes in all of medieval history. Baldwin lay on a stretcher in the shadows while the child was crowned. The boy was too small for the congregation to see, so Balian of Ibelin lifted the child onto his shoulders and held him there for the entire ceremony. A dying king in the shadows, a bewildered child on a giant's shoulders. But Saladin wasn't done. He struck at the fortress of Kerak, deep in the Transjordan, during a royal wedding. Princess Isabella was marrying Humphrey of Tauron. While guests danced inside the great hall, Saladin's trebuchets hammered the walls. Dust rained from the ceiling into wine cups. A strange moment cut through the violence. Lady Stephanie, the groom's mother, sent platters of wedding food to Saladin's tent. The Sultan asked which tower the newlyweds were sleeping in, then ordered his engineers to avoid bombarding that specific tower. Chivalry between enemies in the middle of a siege. But courtesy doesn't feed a starving garrison. Signal fires were lit. Desperate messages slipped through Saladin's lines to Jerusalem. And one final time, the dying man on the litter gave an order: "Prepare me for travel." The army of Jerusalem marches out, armored knights on war horses, banners cracking in the desert wind, and at the center of this steel column, swaying between horses, is a curtained box. Inside lies a 23-year-old man who cannot see, cannot walk, cannot grip a cup of water, commanding by whisper, riding toward Kerak, riding toward his last act. When Saladin's scouts reported the approaching force, they didn't report a new general. They didn't report an army size. They reported one specific thing. The king's litter was in the column. Saladin understood what that meant. The Leper King had dragged his dying body across the desert one more time. And Saladin withdrew. He had the numbers. He had the position. But he had stood at Montgisard. He knew what happened when an army fought with Baldwin's litter at its centre. He knew the morale was incalculable. He knew the cost wasn't worth it. The siege was lifted. Kerak was saved. Baldwin was carried through the gates, not as a conqueror, but as a dying saviour. The journey broke what little remained of him. He returned to Jerusalem, a husk. There would be no more rides. On March 16th, 1185, Baldwin IV died. He was 24 years old. He had reigned for 11 years past the point where every physician had written him off. For the first time since childhood, he was not in pain. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, feet from the hill of Golgotha, a king who suffered in his flesh, laid beside the site of the world's most famous suffering. His death uncorked a disaster. Within a year, his nephew, the child king, died. He was 9. The throne was empty. And Sibylla executed a political maneuver so brazen, it still stuns historians. She agreed to divorce Guy de Lusignan in exchange for the crown. The barons accepted. They crowned her queen. Then, crown on her head, she announced her choice for a new husband. She chose Guy de Lusignan. She took the crown from her own head and placed it on his. Everything Baldwin had engineered in his final years, undone in a single gesture. Balian of Ibelin refused to serve. I will not kiss the hand of a man who destroyed the kingdom. What came next was Reynald de Chatillon, a rogue baron with no impulse control. With Baldwin dead and Guy too weak to restrain him, Reynald shattered the truce by attacking a Muslim caravan. He slaughtered the merchants and threw the survivors into his dungeons. Saladin demanded justice. Guy delivered nothing. The truce was broken. Saladin declared holy war. In July 1187, Guy, ignoring every strategic principle Baldwin had followed for a decade, marched his army away from their water sources and onto the waterless plateau east of Tiberias. He walked directly into the trap Baldwin had spent his entire reign avoiding. At the Horns of Hattin, the crusader army was annihilated, dehydrated, choking on smoke from brushfires Saladin had deliberately set. The Knights of Jerusalem were surrounded and destroyed. The true cross, the relic Baldwin had wept before at Montgisard, was captured. Guy was taken prisoner. 3 months later, Jerusalem fell. But Saladin did not repeat the massacre the Crusaders had committed in 1099. Christians who could pay a ransom were allowed to leave. The churches were not burned. And Saladin left Baldwin's tomb untouched. He visited it. We don't know what he thought. But while he tore the crosses from the dome of the rock, he let the Leper King rest in peace. It was a silent acknowledgement from one great commander to another. Here is the sharpest truth in this entire story. Baldwin IV, blind, crippled, rotting in his throne, held the kingdom of Jerusalem together for 11 years. Guy de Lusignan, healthy, whole, with every physical advantage, destroyed it in 2. Could the kingdom have survived if Baldwin had lived another decade? Maybe. He had proven at Montgisard and Kerak that Saladin could be checked when met with competence and an absolute refusal to calculate personal cost. But history doesn't trade in what might have been. What it records is this: a boy who could not feel his own hand, held the weight of a civilization on his shoulders. When he finally set it down, everything collapsed within 36 months. He was buried without a monument. Pilgrims walk over his grave every day without knowing. The silver mask you've seen in the movie, almost certainly fiction. No contemporary source mentions it. He hid behind silk veils, not to create mystique, but to spare people the sight of his face falling apart. The veil is more powerful than the mask anyway. The mask is a costume. The veil is a young man holding himself together by sheer will, because a kingdom needs him to. That is the lesson he left behind. You cannot control what happens to your body. You cannot control the time you are born into, or the enemies you face. You can only control your response. Authority doesn't come from physical strength. It comes from presence, from the willingness to suffer alongside your people and refuse to leave the field. When Baldwin ordered his litter carried into the desert toward Kerak, he wasn't making a military calculation. He was making a statement. I am still here. I am still standing, even if I have to lie down to do it. Remember the boy who felt nothing in his right arm and didn't understand what it meant. Remember the funeral that never happened. Remember the last curtained box, swaying through the desert, toward a city that needed saving. The face we show the world matters infinitely less than what burns behind it. If this story reached you, drop a comment with where you're watching from. Something about people from opposite ends of the world connecting over a 12th century old king feels like exactly the kind of thing Baldwin would have found worth fighting for.